the Me&my Health Up podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Harcher, a clinical nutritionist and lifestyle medicine specialist. The purpose of this podcast is to enhance and enlighten your well-being. And today we have a plant-based naturopath, Camilla Brinkworth, and she shares her insights on her journey on how she went from having arthritis in her early 20s to totally reversing it and healing it using plant-based diets. She shares all her learnings in this episode of where she went wrong and how she's corrected it and how she does it so successfully today. So join me in this fantastic episode with Camilla Brinkworth. Welcome on the Me&my Health Up podcast. How are you, Camilla Brinkworth?
I'm great. I'm in Ubud, so I'm extremely hot. But aside from that, I'm really good, thank you.
Oh, fantastic. In terms of helping the listeners understand your location, you want to share a bit more around your location?
Yeah, so I'm currently really in the jungle, I would say, about 15 minutes outside of Ubud in Bali. And it's gloriously warm here today, which I don't think it is in Sydney. I hear the temperature dropped again. Is that right?
It did. Yeah. So we've been relieved. We had a sweltering week. And,
yes, I heard.
This weekend it's dropped and it's really nice, actually. It's nice. Pleasant.
Lovely.
Yeah. So Camilla, please share with the listeners how you've arrived at what you're doing today.
Yeah, and so I'm a plant-based naturopath and nutritionist, and my journey, it's been a really, really long journey to get here. Essentially, I had really terrible health when I was growing up. I experienced a huge amount of anxiety, a huge amount of depression. I developed arthritis at 19 years old, which was pretty horrendous. And by age 24, there were points at which my arthritis was so bad that I couldn't even clasp my fingers together and hold a pen or hold a mascara brush at that age, which wasn't great. I was in a lot of pain. And I always had an interest in healthy food, but I hadn't been raised in that climate at all. I've been brought up on a diet of things like fried chicken and microwave chips, and the only vegetables to be seen were, one serving of something that had been boiled or microwaved to death and thus had pretty much no nutritional value. So I wasn't set up with the kind of diet that I have now, but I was always intrigued by it. It was almost by fate that when I got a dog, I connected to animals in a really different way and I went vegetarian. And what I noticed from that was that my arthritic pain reduced by about 50% at that point, which was kind of amazing. And I really saw that connection between the foods that we're putting in our bodies and how our bodies feel. And then a few years later, when I learned more about the environmental implications of animal products, I decided to go vegan. And I accidentally reversed my arthritis in about 2 weeks after going vegan. I woke up one morning and I had no pain in my neck for almost the first time in 10 years, which was incredible. But I've got to say that part of the reason I do what I do, which is help people thrive on a plant-based diet, is because I didn't get it right from the beginning. And there were actually, on that very, very long journey, there were many points in time where I got it really wrong. And I thought it was a problem with the vegan diet, but actually it was a problem with the way that I was eating. So one of my missions now is to help people who do want to be vegetarian or they do want to be vegan for whatever reason, and to help them thrive, because that's not information that a lot of us get. And there are so many awful things on the internet telling us to eat 40 bananas a day or to eat nothing but orange juice all day or just a plate of salad with one tomato on, and none of that is going to lead to optimal long-term health. So that's what I'm here for.
Wow. What a story in terms of, turning around your health and going about changing things and then seeing the changes in your body. So in terms of how you went about that change, because I know we studied together you studied naturopathy. And
yes.
Did you start the diet pre-study or during your studies?
So I started, the movement from to vegetarian was long before studying, or not long before, but a few years before studying. But I, even at that point, really wasn't getting it right at all. I was eating a very, very limited diet that really wasn't, my pain had reduced. So there were obviously some benefits, but there were other things that just really weren't working. My iron was clearly low. I was really fatigued. I was getting sick a lot. And yes, it really wasn't, I wasn't doing vegetarian particularly well. And then it took me maybe a year into studying during my naturopathy degree, and also reading a huge amount of plant-based health material from, plant-based doctors who've been plant-based themselves for decades, and really learning the ins and outs, spending hundreds, if not thousands of hours researching it. And I eventually got it right. And my health has been fantastic as a result of that.
Fantastic. And you're still vegan?
I am, yes. Yeah. It's been almost 8 years now. So,
wow.
Yeah, my hair hasn't fallen out, and I have plenty of energy, and my mood is fantastic. And, I'm a human being, so I have my ups and downs. I get sick from time to time. Sometimes I get sad because I'm human. So it's not as though I walk around in a cloud all day, just, smiling and impervious to anything. But in general, my standard of health has done nothing but benefit from this way of living for me.
Working with your clients, where have you found they typically go wrong? So where are the common areas that people, when they start a plant-based diet, that they typically don't go about it the right way?
There are so many. And, most of us aren't brought up, actually, regardless of whether we're vegetarian, vegan, or omnivorous, most of us aren't brought up knowing how to eat a healthy, balanced diet. But even less so are we taught how to eat a healthy plant-based diet. So things that I often see, some people still unfortunately don't know that B12 supplementation is a non-negotiable unless you've been told by your healthcare provider that you absolutely don't need to based on your very recent B12 blood work. I would say that often people aren't eating enough of the right types of food. So, I sometimes see people who are eating nothing but a big plate of vegetables. They're missing out on key nutrients there. Often people are even eating all the right kinds of food, but they're actually eating it in such minuscule quantities that it's really not giving them anything that they need. I had one client, and when I ran through her diet, it sounded as though she was eating what we would consider a pretty flawless plant-based diet. But then once I broke down the quantities of those foods, there was no way that they were meeting her nutritional requirements at all. Those would be some key ones, I would say.
Okay, so certainly the person that's having a plate of vegetables is probably not meeting their protein requirements.
No. So the foods that we really want to emphasize on a plant-based diet, that our key food groups are things like legumes, whole grains, vegetables, fruits, nuts, and seeds. And most of our protein, or our larger protein contribution, is coming from foods like legumes and whole grains. So foods like tofu, tempeh, fantastic sources. If somebody is, an athlete or working out a lot, then they may benefit from a plant-based protein powder. But in my own situation, I haven't used one for years, and I track what I'm eating with Chronometer once a year, just for 3 days. And the last time I did that was maybe 2 weeks ago, and I hit absolutely every macronutrient, micronutrient, bar vitamin E. I think I was about 30% lower than I should have been on that, but everything else was perfect. My protein is, 1.5 times what I require for my body weight and my level of activity. So you absolutely can get it right. As long as you're using a B12 supplement, and as long as you're eating the right kind of foods in the right balance. And that's how I like to help people.
And in terms of, I was just thinking, you mentioned like the legumes and the whole grains and all those, tempeh and tofu as good protein sources. What is a good breakfast for someone starting out on a plant-based diet?
So my favorite breakfast is, I like to start the day with overnight oats, which I mix in with. So I use either steel cut or rolled oats. I've been using rolled recently, and I actually soak them in water, not even nut milk. But if you wanted or soy milk, if you wanted a bit of a calcium boost on that meal, you could use something like an unsweetened soy milk that had calcium fortified. I don't use any calcium fortified products because I eat so many dark green leafy vegetables that I really don't need to. So yes, overnight oats with whatever liquid you want to use. I mix some carob in. I then top that with mixed berries. So that's probably my most boring, straightforward meal of the day. I'll let you into a secret. I actually hate cooking. So I love preparing healthy food, but my cooking skills are horrific. So essentially what I do for my lunches and my dinner is I steam things like sweet potato, huge amounts of greens, cruciferous vegetables, so things like broccoli or cauliflower. I like sweet corn, basically as many different colorful veggies as possible. So I'll steam those. And then I'll also pan fry, and I try not to use cooking oils or really minimum use of oils. But I will pan fry some tempeh, a big portion of mushrooms, because they are such a good source of B vitamins. And I'll pan fry them with some chopped garlic, chopped onion. I'm missing something. That's kind of, my basic lunches and dinners are these huge plates of vegetables with tempeh and mushrooms.
Sounds delicious. It's making me a bit hungry.
It's making me hungry, actually.
Yeah, it's probably your lunchtime, is it?
I had a bit of a nightmare prior to this. My gas on my stove just suddenly stopped working. So
you haven't had lunch?
I haven't had what I would usually have.
Okay. You mentioned on your journey that you struggled to get enough iron. So I'm really keen to explore the topic of iron.
I should also say, with my journey, when I was actually struggling with iron, that was actually when I was vegetarian as opposed to when I was vegan. When I was vegetarian, I did what a lot of people who are vegetarian do, and I just cut out meat and I added in cheese and eggs, basically, instead of meat. So I actually wasn't bringing lots of plant foods into my diet at all at that point. I was actually still eating a pretty heavy animal protein diet. It just wasn't meat. And my iron levels really suffered. I definitely was not feeling very well, didn't look very well. In terms of iron, so the interesting thing is that there are studies showing that vegans in general don't seem to have higher levels of iron deficiency than omnivores, even though there's that really strong mental connotation between iron deficient vegans, etc. Another interesting thing is that we tend to get more iron as a milligram amount than non-vegans and non-vegetarians. But that iron, as you know, that we get from our diet is non-heme iron, which means that it's less readily uptaken by the body. But there are factors that we can do to enhance that uptake. So vitamin C with our foods. In fact, garlic has been shown to increase it, apple cider vinegar before our foods, making sure that our digestion is in a really healthy state, and definitely keeping tea and coffee away from our foods as well. That's a huge one.
Fantastic tips there. You mentioned calcium earlier, and you said you don't have an issue with calcium because you have lots of dark leafy green vegetables. But generally, you hear that there is a concern around calcium with plant-based diets. So, just share.
Yeah, of course. So my chronometer reading says that I get about 2 grams of calcium a day. So that's over double what, what we're told we're supposed to have and what you get 3 glasses of milk, etc. I've got to say, because of its oxalate content, I don't eat a lot of spinach. I keep that really low. But what I do eat a lot of is kale, and kale is and other dark green leafy vegetables as well. And those are very good sources of calcium. I don't eat the quantities of dark green leafies that most people are putting on their plate. So again, like my clients who are eating the perfect diet on paper, just having a sprinkle of this fruit, then sprinkle of that. I'm talking big portions of green thing. And that's something that's really recommended by the plant-based doctors, particularly the ones who have been working with cardiovascular disease, reversing heart disease, and showing that clinically, the improvement of arterial blood flow. They are recommending that with every meal, actually, we have a big portion of dark greens. So I do that with both my lunch and dinner, and I'm really easily meeting my calcium that way. Other foods, though, would be nuts and seeds. Tahini is a really good source. There are small amounts of calcium in everything, though. I mean, I think even oranges have about 50 milligrams of calcium or something. So over the course of the day, it definitely can add up.
So how many cups would you have of the kale in a given meal?
Do you want to see?
Yeah, I'd love to see, because this is
Let me go to my
videoed. So
Let me
Camilla's
show you
just
what
going to her fridge to get her kale to show how much she has in a meal. So those that are listening, we'll do our best to explain it, but those watching YouTube will actually see how much kale that Camilla eats. Oh, wow.
So these are my greens that sit in my fridge. I was about to prepare lunch, so this is actually quite a good thing. So I was about to prepare lunch until the stove broke. This is how much mushrooms I was going to eat for lunch and dinner.
Wow.
These are 8 different types of greens and 4 different types of kale here. This is the delight of living in Bali. I get this organic delivery to my house in banana leaves, which is amazing. And I would get through those over I get deliveries every 2 to 3 days, a lot of food. And that is one thing people should know. If you're on a plant-based diet, we're looking at very different portions of food to what we're used to eating with omnivorous food. So I could eat foods like that. And if I just ate that, I would be really under in calories. I wouldn't be feeling well at all. We need to eat much, much larger portions of these kind of calorie dilute foods, but that are so micronutrient rich. The calories really are coming from things like sweet potato, foods like avocado, from nuts, from seeds, from the tempeh, etc., etc.
Wow. And for the listeners, in terms of what Camilla was showing, she was showing a banana leaf with all these mushrooms inside the banana leaf. And it would be at least a full plate. Like if you think of a dinner plate, would that be about the right size, Camilla?
So once I've cooked my food, I'd say with a dinner plate, a good at least a third of that to half of that is a very packed dark green leafies and mushrooms, I would say. I actually put some pictures on my Instagram of what my plates look like. So you can always head over there to have a look.
Okay, we'll include the Instagram link in the show notes so you can check out Camilla's Instagram and see what her plates look like. How much green veg and how much mushrooms and the portions on each dinner plate.
I've had people who are horrified. I've had teachers at Endeavour where I studied my naturopathy who are horrified by my portions of food, but I'm very much within the healthy weight range, and I have no issues with, no concerns about watching calories, and haven't needed to, and have been eating this way for a really long time. So,
and I was thinking, with all that fiber, you wouldn't need to be concerned about moving your bowels, right?
No, definitely not. So that's another thing. When I look at my micronutrient intake, micro and macronutrient intake, not only do I hit pretty much everything very, very well, but I get about 70 grams of fiber a day. And I know men who are eating this way because they're eating higher calories, and I've got a few friends who are vegan athletes, and they're getting more like 100 grams of fiber, a very good friend to my digestive system.
Absolutely. So that would be at least double what you're having, is at least double the recommended daily intake of fiber. Yeah. And most of the plant-based doctors would say that the recommended daily intakes are really very, very low, and most people really aren't meeting them at all. I have to add at this point that one thing that I see vegans with in clinic most often, and I think this is really interesting, is SIBO. They simply aren't able to tolerate these kind of foods that I'm eating, these really high fiber foods, until we treat the SIBOs. So I will work with them in a way that's completely respectful to their plant-based or vegan diet, but we will treat it, they will get much better, and then they'll be able to manage these foods again. And it's not the vegan diet that's caused the SIBO, but those really healthy high fiber foods actually will exacerbate it. And in my mind, that's why people often feel much better when they do suddenly eat a piece of fish and they're like, oh, I'm fine, but the fish isn't coming with fiber, whereas these plant foods are. And in terms of SIBO, please explain that for the listeners, just so that
So small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which is quite a predominant reason behind IBS symptoms, and it can manifest in constipation or it can manifest in diarrhea. It's related to a whole host of other systemic conditions too, and it's something that you test. I know gastroenterologists have their own ways of testing, but in terms of functional medicine or nutritionists or naturopaths, we can ascertain that assess that with a breath test, which is quite simple but not particularly pleasant for people. And I do find that where people come to me with SIBO, and it's a very straightforward SIBO case, when we do make that dietary modification to keep the fiber really, really low whilst treating it, they feel so much better so quickly. But so much of the evidence for long-term health points to these high fiber, predominantly plant-based foods. So in my mind, the most important thing is really to treat them so that they're able to tolerate the fruits, the veggies, and all the other beautiful plant foods too.
And just getting back to the quantities, I just want to, I guess, round that out. It was because I'm thinking, do you have more than 3 meals a day, or you have just three big meals?
So my breakfast, I would say, is quite normal. Although to be fair, I did have some, as well as a pretty decently sized bowl of oats. I had a couple of passion fruits and a mango before. I will usually have some fruit as well, but no, I just have the 3 meals. I don't do a lot of exercise, to be honest. I do move my body every day, but I'm definitely not an athlete by any stretch of the imagination. But if I were, then I'd probably, maybe be eating 4 meals or a protein shake, something like that.
Yeah, no, I just really wanted to get it into context for the listeners, because when you showed me, what you consume over a 2 or 3 day period, I'm thinking, if you just look at just lunches and dinners, you do have quite a sizable amount.
I do. Absolutely. Yeah. And the interesting thing is, the foods that I showed you are the very calorie dilute ones.
Yes.
But, on top of those and, hefty portions of those dark greens, hefty portions of those mushrooms, I've also got my sweet potato, my tempeh, whatever other vegetables. I try and, mix it up, because we know that for gut health, one of the best things is having as large a diversity of unprocessed plant foods as possible.
Do you work with athletes on a plant-based diet?
I haven't worked with athletes. I've worked with people with very active lifestyles, and generally that just requires being, bringing in more things like protein powders, even those the bean pastas that have some of them have an obscene amount of protein per serving. It's like 30 grams of protein per serve. But I have very close friends who are vegan bodybuilders, vegan athletes. So I've known a lot of these people, but they haven't needed my services. They've been doing very well.
And in terms of other areas that you commonly see people trip up in, so you've mentioned some really good areas in terms of not eating, good quantities of everything to make sure that they meet the daily recommended intakes. Are there any other particular macros or micros that you commonly see where people aren't getting enough of?
I would say calcium, if they're not eating enough, particularly dark green leafy vegetables. Two of the things that I bring in to people, as long as they can tolerate them and as long as they're happy to include them, two of the things that I think are really, really key when I've looked for myself at my chronometer and seen where am I getting my B vitamins from, where am I getting everything from, calcium being one of them, dark green leafies and mushrooms. Mushrooms, in terms of B vitamins, just such a winner. I know that we get, you can meet your B vitamin needs on a plant-based diet without them, but they do make things much, much easier.
And in terms of the fats, so we've spoken, a lot about the carbohydrates, the proteins, but we haven't really explored the fats. So let's dive into that. How do you get your fat?
Okay, so you can get a very varied amount of fat on a plant-based diet. So the healthiest sources would be things like avocados, nuts, and seeds. They're really, really high in fat. My preference in terms of meeting my omega needs is a new ingredient called ahi flour, but people often use flax seeds, chia seeds, hemp seeds are actually higher in omega-6. than omega-3, which is the same as walnuts. So even though those foods are really healthy, I wouldn't be relying upon them as your sources of omega-3. I also have a bit of a passion for a fruit that some listeners probably haven't heard of, which is durian. And that's got a nice fat content too. So that's actually my favorite snack, to be honest. But even something like tahini, you could put some, if you do that breakfast that I told you about, and you mix in some tahini, a big tablespoon of tahini with the carob, oh my gosh, delicious. It's like a creamy chocolate dessert for breakfast.
And tahini is really high in calcium. So
yeah,
certainly get your calcium up. And
absolutely.
You mentioned the ahi flour.
Ahi flour, yes,
Yeah.
So that's a new omega ingredient that I'm really, really passionate about. It's essentially a complete omega-3, 6, and 9, but it's giving you more advanced omega-3 metabolites than flax or chia. It's giving you something called stearidonic acid, and that's something that we find in hemp seeds, but actually ahi flour is providing that at about 10 times the amount as hemp, which is pretty incredible. Whilst it's also providing something called GLA, which is what we find in evening primrose oil. So in my mind, it's the best balanced, most complete, broader spectrum omega source that we have.
And the ahi flour, right?
Ahi flour, yeah.
Ahi flour.
Ahi is as in tuna, because the concept of it is that it could be a fish replacement because it converts to EPA, which is one of the long chain omega-3 metabolites, up to four times more effectively than flax. So ahi is ahi tuna, and flour is the plant that it's come from.
Okay. So in terms of the plant, the flour, do you just add it to your stir fries or your salads, or how do you consume it?
So it's a pressed seed oil.
Okay.
So it comes, it's not actually a flour. It's a plant with a beautiful flower, and it's regeneratively grown, really, really sustainable. And essentially those seeds, the oil is extracted, and you can take that in a capsule at this point in time, but in the future it will become available as a food as well, which is really exciting.
Okay. So it's a supplement that's available on the
Yeah, at the moment, it's not available until November in Australia. It only became approved as a new ingredient in July 2023, and it will be available in Australia in November. But we do hope that in a couple of years' time, when people are more familiar with it as an ingredient, that it will make it down to being a food as well, just to make it so much more accessible for everybody.
Absolutely. First time I've heard about it was by you. So never heard of it.
That's the thing. Most people haven't. It's been around in America and Europe for a while. We were the first people to actually bring it through to be approved as a novel ingredient. So that's why we're so passionate about it.
Oh, fantastic. And how can the listeners best connect with you, Camilla?
So my Instagram is probably the best way to find me, which is at Camilla Claire Naturopathy. And I also have a new podcast and YouTube myself, which is the Phyto Love podcast or the Phyto Love channel on YouTube.
Fantastic. And for the listeners, I'll include those links in the show notes. And I'd really like to say thank you, Camilla, for coming on the show and sharing all your knowledge around plant-based eating and how to do that successfully. I really appreciate you, I guess, enduring the sweltering heat over there.
Yeah, I managed to get through this without passing out. So thank you so much for your time and your questions, Anthony.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. Podcast disclaimer. This podcast and any information, advice, opinions or statements within it do not constitute medical, healthcare or professional advice and are provided for general information purposes only. All care is taken in the preparation of the information in this podcast. Connected Wellness Proprietary Limited, operating under the brand me&my Health Up, does not make any representations or give any warranties about its accuracy, reliability, completeness, or suitability for any particular purpose. This podcast and any information, advice, opinions, or statements within it are not to be used as a substitute for professional, medical, psychological, psychiatric, or any other mental health care or healthcare in general. me&my Health Up recommends you seek the advice of a doctor or qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Inform your doctor of any changes that you made to your lifestyle and discuss these with your doctor. Do not disregard medical advice or delay visiting a medical professional because of something you hear in this podcast. This podcast has been carefully prepared on the basis of current information.
changes in circumstances after publication may affect the accuracy of this information. To the maximum extent permitted by the law, me&my Health disclaims any such representations or warranties to the completeness, accuracy, merchantability, or fitness for purpose of this podcast, and will not be liable for any expenses, losses, damages incurred, indirect or consequential damages or costs that may be incurred as a result of the information being inaccurate or incomplete in any way and for any reason. No part of this podcast can be reproduced, redistributed, published, copied, or duplicated in a form without prior permission of me&my Health.